Fanboys, fangirls, and fans of every type. I have a problem. I have a real problem with estimating how long a project is going to take me to complete, and how long my finished movie is even going to be. My spotlight on Spike Feresten is the 16th entry into my late night saga, maybe the 17th as well. When I started trying to produce content on a semi-regular basis, I laid out the following formats for myself. The Late Night Wars were supposed to be a long-form media conflict between two or more celebrities, at least one of them involved in late night television. And the Saga entries were supposed to be a long-form without conflict, like Three's a Crowd, just sort of taking a look at a particular era in television. The Melee was supposed to be a short-form conflict, and the Spotlight was a short-form without conflict, like Spotlight on Pat Sajak. Just one host just telling their story. Probably the best example of this I did was the first melee between Rona Barrett and Tom Snyder. It was the perfect subject for a short because it wasn't much of an event and there was very little material to be found on it. Since most of the material I found was going to be taken from articles and newspapers and magazines, it was all going to be narrated by me. And I usually prefer to let the celebrities speak for themselves, the people who participated in the events. So I try to keep my narration as minimal as possible. I put it in wherever it's needed to sort of link clips together. But if a short is going to be entirely me, then it's another reason I would like it to be short. I wanted to design some short formats so that I could produce some videos more quickly to sort of pace out the videos that were going to take me a longer amount of time. I was trying to produce at least one video a month. So if one video took me almost 2 months to complete and another one could be done in like a week, then those would sort of balance out. So that was the intent of the shorts. And we can already see how this failed because my second melee between Howard Stern and Magic Johnson was like 30 minutes long. It was almost as long as all of the Wars videos that I have come out with, so it wasn't any shorter than anything else. And this spotlight on Spike Feresten is actually the longest video I've ever produced. It's almost an hour and a half long. It's feature length, for crying out loud. And it's not lost on me that I just produced a spotlight on 7 women that was only 29 minutes long. So obviously I'm just a terrible male chauvinist pig. There were really 2 reasons this happened. One, with the women of 130, there were virtually no interviews with these 7 women talking about their own careers and depth. The only one I found was the foundation interviews with Linda Ellerby, and which is why her section of that video is the longest section of all the women that I focused on, because there was more to find on her, but still not that much. And with Spike, I found numerous podcasts where he talked in great detail about his own career, and he's a great storyteller. So there was much more material to work with. But what I didn't know when I started this was just how many other late night shows Spike was involved with. Saturday Night Live, David Letterman, Space Ghost, and I'd never even heard of Night Music. Some of the stuff in between, like Seinfeld, Dana Carvey, the B Movie, these weren't really relevant to the story of Spike in late night, but just like Pat Sajak was mostly known for Wheel of Fortune, Spike Feresten seems to mostly be known for creating the Soup Nazi, so it sort of felt important to stick that piece in there. And more than that, there's a through line of car culture that runs from Letterman to Seinfeld to Car Matchmaker, but talk show is right in the middle. Spike says most of the comedy he tried to do on Car Matchmaker was the same style he was doing on Talk Show, the man on the street sort of improv comedy. So it's kind of hard to separate all those different shows from each other when you look at Spike's career. When I was working on this video, I paused once again to think about, what am I doing at the Late Night Saga? I kind of thought about the Joan Rivers, Johnny Carson video again. That was the first one where I really felt I was leaning too heavily on one source. At the beginning, I was narrating almost the entire video out of those foundation interviews with Joan Rivers. And I sort of felt like, if all I'm doing is taking somebody else's videos and just kind of shortening them to the good bits, it's not really something worth doing. When I did the first Late Night War, what I was really doing was taking a million bits and pieces from different places, because no one person told the whole story. But if the foundation interviews were going to tell the entire story of Joan Rivers' career, then I'm not just going to steal the whole set and just kind of shorten them, because what's the point? But if I could take, a few pieces from there, pieces from elsewhere, and then grab all the videos that they're alluding to in those interviews to demonstrate exactly what it is she's talking about. Then I might be adding something to the whole creative aspect of these videos. So what I'm saying is I try not to take too much from any one source. With Spike, I didn't really know that much about him, and when I started this project, I found one podcast, which was the Late Night Playset, and it's on video, which is nice, instead of just having, audio only with a picture or whatever, which is what I ended up doing for many parts of this video. After my first listen of that podcast, it seemed like Spike told almost the entire story of his career, and I thought, well, this is it. This is the only video I need to source from. I can just, cut and paste this to the good bits and then find pieces from the shows that he's worked on as examples. But, once again, I thought, I don't really want to do that. I don't want to steal this guy's entire podcast video and just call it my own. So I started looking for more sources, and ultimately I found 4 podcasts, all of them at least an hour long, where Spike talked about his entire career. So I thought, this is good. Not only can I diversify sources, but interestingly, he tells the story differently each time. So I can cherry pick the bits and pieces, the best tellings of each story. And some of the podcasts, like they all talk about Seinfeld. They all talk about the Soup Nazi. But they don't all talk about his time on Saturday Night Live. They don't all talk about his time on Space Ghost. So only one of them had the night music story, which I'd never even heard of that show. And probably none of the other podcasters had either, because none of them asked about it. So that was really, worked out to my benefit. So I look at it this way, and I'm going to look at my notes for just a second. The Late Night Playset interview is 68 minutes long. The Edge is 75 minutes. The Nighttime Show, 96 minutes. The Nerdist podcast, 72 minutes. The Larry King interview is 16 minutes. I took 2 Stephen Colbert interviews at 26 minutes combined. All told, I had 257 minutes of source material to work from, and my final video was only about 85 minutes, an hour 25. And not all of my 85 minutes was just those clips from those podcasts. I found a lot of other reference videos. I looked up a lot of facts and figures to, put into all the little podcast segments where there was nothing visual happening. And I thought that would, both tell the story, but also to just make it visually more appealing. And finally, it occurred to me that what I'm doing here at Fanboy Films is running a content distillery. Like an old moonshiner sitting in a shack up on a mountain, brewing his sour mash into liquid gold. I sit here in my garage studio, scraping the internet for fruit ripening on the vine that I can mash and purify into the video equivalent of white lightning. Now, on a personal note, I worked at a local Fox affiliate from 1999 till 2008, overlapping the time when Talk Show with Spike Feresten was on the air. And I think Spike is right when he says the network didn't promote him. I don't remember ever seeing any sample shows. Very rarely did we ever run any promos. Never saw any merchandise or posters. I think I was aware of the show because we had a program grid up in the lobby that showed the entire week's worth of programming, what was on each night of the week, and his name, the name of the show was on there, Talk Show with Spike Feresten. That's about as much as I knew about it. I might have seen a promo once or twice. And ultimately, I think I probably did see a few minutes of the show somewhere, and to be honest, I found it kind of irritating. When I decided to expand the Late Night Saga beyond that original video, I, started looking up names that I could cover, and one of them that came up was Spike Feresten. Out of curiosity, I looked up the show to see if I remembered any of it, and nothing looked familiar, and there were only very few clips on YouTube. Not much could be found. And to be honest, I had pretty much the same reaction. I didn't think it was all that great. But I thought if I really dove into it, eventually I would be able to give it a fair shake. After I finished The Women of 130, I was looking for a short subject to do next to try to get something out of the way quickly before I moved on to the next long thing. I thought Spike's show would be a sure lock for a short subject because it wasn't on very long and there wasn't much I could find about it. Little did I know. Just like The Women of 130 was originally going to be a spotlight on Cynthia Garrett, I ended up expanding it, covering many more topics. And in the same way, I thought Spike's spotlight was just going to be about Talk Show, but I ended up expanding it to more shows. I found Spike to really be a fantastic storyteller, and he really painted a picture of backstage goings-on in Hollywood at all these different shows that I don't think I've really heard from anyone else. And so I thought if I could really collect the best of these stories from all these different podcasts, it really might make a cool video. I really built this project in a linear fashion. When I started, I really just jotted down the titles of all the different chapters I was going to do, sort of hit each point in Spike's career, all the different shows. And then I would just go through and I would just work on each one in order, eventually getting to talk show, which is going to be one of the last stops. At some point, I realized my self-imposed deadline was coming up, and I was really only halfway through collecting all the bits and pieces I was going to need, to say nothing of color correcting and building graphics and audio and all doing all that stuff. So I decided for the very first time to cut a video in half.
We could split it up, do a side A, side B type of thing. It's been done before. What the hell, right?
Let's see if we can cut this pumpkin in two.
Try to get the first half done by my deadline, and then save the other half for later. I finished part one, and then I went over to my second channel to do my review of Mrs. America, which also ended up much longer than I thought it was going to be. Maybe from now on, I should take all my project estimates and just triple them, or quadruple them. When I finally reached the point in my video where it was time to talk about Spike's talk show, I downloaded all the clips I could find on YouTube, which weren't many. I had to go to Dailymotion, Vimeo, I found some on Facebook, and I reviewed all the clips that I could find, and I found out once again that I didn't really like it. The whole show plays more like a parody of a talk show. It seems very cringe, so many of the sketches. But then, I kind of had an aha moment. I saw one sketch, which I didn't even include in my video, which was all about Spike trying meth. And he leaves the studio, he just calls one of his guests in the audience who has some meth on him. They go off in his office and they do some meth and they get high and they come back to the studio and then they want more and they go back and they do more. And then he ends up going to rehab, and then he comes out of rehab and he immediately gets hooked again. Then he ends up, I think, killing the guy, and then he's trying to like find a way to dispose of the body. So I realized that it was really taking it to an absurd level. And I realized, finally, that's when I realized that he was doing an absurdity thing. In some ways, it kind of reminds me of what I've seen of the Eric Andre show. I just don't think he took it that far, and maybe he needed to take it a little farther to prove the point, or maybe I just didn't see enough of it to get it. But finally, I think I understand why I didn't like it originally and what he was trying to do. When I finally started building part two, there were some things that I decided to change, and this is really nitpicking, but the font that I used for all the little factoids I put up is called Gotham, and it has two different types of quotation marks. There was a default kind that I used for part one, but then I remember there was another type of quote that I liked better, so I switched and used that for part two. But now it's not consistent between the two parts. But I also wasn't planning on using anything from Spike's Car Radio podcast, so I hadn't looked any of it up. It wasn't until I got to the end of Car Matchmaker and I was kind of just figuring out, how do I end this thing? And I go, well, he went from Car Matchmaker to the Car Radio, maybe I should find something from that. And I found out that he had interviewed Dennis Miller, who was, an important part of part one, the very first part of the story that I told, but I had never heard Dennis's version of it. I didn't even know it existed. I hadn't even bothered to look it up back when I was doing chapter one of this thing. Again, because I did this video in kind of a linear fashion. If I had known about this interview at the time, I would have included parts of that in chapter one, back when Spike was talking about SNL. I mean, in some ways it's cool because the whole story is told from Spike's perspective and not anybody else's, but I think, except for Dana Carvey, who kind of takes over his segment. But to me, it's clear, and maybe to nobody else, that part one would have been different. If I would have known what I was going to do at the end of part two, then I would have done part one differently. If I can digress for a minute, it's kind of like I finally saw the Donner cut of Superman 2. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but just bear with me on this. Originally, Superman 1 and 2 were supposed to be shot together as one big movie shoot. They were going to edit both. Part one was going to end on a cliffhanger. It was going to be released in theaters. And then part two was going to follow like 3 months later and resolve the cliffhanger. But we all know that didn't happen. The shoot was stopped early. Part one was finished and released in theaters without the cliffhanger. They changed the original plan for the movie. And then they came back together a couple years later and reshot a lot of stuff, got a new director. Donner was out. and they finished part 2 without, concluding a cliffhanger, because now they were 2 separate movies. So now, many years later, Richard Donner is able to return part 2 more closely to what it was originally scripted to be. The problem is, we've never had a Donner cut of part 1. So if you look at part 1 and the Donner cut of part 2 together, they don't really line up. And that's what I'm talking about with my Spike video. So that's really all I'm saying in this video. Where is the Donner cut of Superman 1? So everyone out there that watches this video, please just do me a favor and start trending, release the Donner cut of Superman 1. That's all I'm saying.